Roman troops were committed without a definition of victory. The purpose of the strategy was to inflict so much pain on the North Vietnamese that they would enter negotiation.
Britain's army was spread all over the world in tiny communities. The army was more accurately a heavily armed imperial police force, which traditionally fought small wars against less well-armed and organized enemies.
Soldier, I had been taught to carry out the orders, and at no time it ever crossed my mind to disobey or to refuse to carry out an order that was issued by my superiors.
So if one of your men had refused to shoot, what would have happened to him? What would you have said to him?
If one of my men had refused to shoot, I shudder to think what had been the repercussions, because it's hard to say now what I would have done looking back. At the time that it actually, when it happened, he would have been in serious trouble.
What kind of trouble?
He could have faced court-martial. He could have been shot on the spot for refusing an order in face of the enemy, in face of hostile fire. Someone refuses to carry out an order, he's in trouble.
But there was no hostile fire.
At the time, we didn't realize that there was no hostile fire at the time.
So are you suggesting that if one of your troops had refused to shoot, shall we say, an old woman or a young child at My Lai on that day, that they would have faced disciplinary action?
They most definitely would have faced disciplinary action had they refused to fire or kill or carry out the orders, yes.
But these were young kids. Most of them had never killed anybody before. I mean, to kill a child seems a monstrous thing. Why were these people able to do this without questioning it?
I feel that they were able to carry out the assigned task, the orders. That meant killing small kids, killing women, because they were soldiers. They were trained that way. They was trained that when you get into combat, it's either you or the enemy. And the people that were in that village, the women, the little kids, the old men, were all considered the enemy.
So, leaving aside the question of following orders, do you think that that order was morally right, and that the actions of the troops that followed that order, yourself included, were behaving in a moral fashion?
I feel that we carried out the orders in a moral fashion, and the orders of destroying the village, of killing the people in the village. I feel that we carried out our orders, and I feel that we did not violate any moral standards.
Okay, I took the photograph. I thought they were going to question the people. But just as soon as I turned and walked away, I heard firing. I looked around over the corner of my shoulder. I saw the people drop. I just kept on walking. At the time, it was just, capturing a reaction. But when you look at it later on in life, you know now these people are dead. They were shot. Just...
Thì tôi chợt nghe tiếng chị của bà la. Trong nhà tôi nhìn ra thì tôi thấy chị Mùi tôi lúc đó là 14 tuổi, trên người vậy một thằng Mỹ nó đang đà chị, trên người chị không còn mặc cái quần áo mà nữa. Nhưng lúc đó tôi không hiểu đó là gì. Và sau này chị tôi ra sức chống cự lại nó. Và sau đó thì bọn Mỹ đã bắn luôn. Sau đó thì bọn Mỹ đứng lên, nó mặc quần áo vào và nó bắn luôn chị.
That day in my life, I was personally responsible for killing between 20 and 25 people, about 25 people, personally. From shooting them, to cutting their throats, to scalping them, to cutting off their hands, and cutting out their tongue. I did that.
it turned out that their level of pain toleration was much higher than had been estimated. I believe the vast majority of Americans, they wanted the war over with. But the biggest problem domestically was whether we could finally unite the country, in which those who wanted peace would have peace, and those who wanted honor could live with themselves.
He'd been in Paris since May of '68, and we got nowhere, because in retrospect, there was only one issue. Was the United States going to get out and be defeated? And nobody was prepared to say, yes, we've lost the war, it's over.
By 1968, Kissinger had visited Vietnam 3 times and had become an advisor to the Johnson administration. Nixon was afraid that a peace accord in Paris might cost him the election. But what Davidson and other members of the Johnson team did not know was that on September 10th, Kissinger had contacted the Nixon campaign by telephone.
We certainly did not know it. Kissinger shared his analysis of what was happening with them, and he was probably by far the most brilliant mind available to them and the most sophisticated analyst.
Kissinger told the Nixon campaign that the Johnson team was close to an agreement with North Vietnam. Until the deal was final, the Johnson team wanted to keep the negotiations secret from South Vietnam. But Nixon had opened a secret channel of communication with South Vietnamese President Thieu. FBI surveillance of the Nixon team's contacts with Thieu confirmed this. Hold on, he was told. We're gonna win. But just 3 days before the election, President Thieu defied Johnson and refused to join the peace negotiations.
Certainly one reason is the advice they got from Nixon's people. It's clear that they were being told to hold out and not go to Paris.
Without the participation of South Vietnam, the peace talks collapsed. Richard Nixon won the popular vote by a margin of less than 1%.
Richard Nixon himself says that he admired Kissinger for his ability to supply secret information.
Dr. Henry Kissinger has agreed to come with the White House staff as the assistant to the President-elect for National Security Affairs. Kissinger is perhaps one of the major scholars in America and the world today in this area. He has never yet had a full-time government assignment, and he will bring to this responsibility a fresh approach.
Nixon set the general line of American policy, but Kissinger really is the conductor of the train. He's the engineer. He's the policy maker, who most importantly is in liaison with the Pentagon, with the Joint Chiefs of Staff, with the CIA. He's conducting the diplomacy as well as the military policy.
I would not use atomic weapons in Vietnam. I would not invade North Vietnam. And incidentally, I would not invade any of the other countries in the area of Vietnam.
I thought it was appropriate to attack those bases.
What about the accusation that hundreds of thousands of defenseless civilians were killed?
Hundreds of thousands is total rubbish. I'm talking about the so-called secret bombing. There was almost no civilian population. Undoubtedly, civilians were killed as a result of military operations. But what I'm saying applies only to the secret bombing.
When they say we're killing civilians, we'll say, well, no, there are a lot of civilians killed in the South. Right.
We now face the unhappy prospect of an expansion of the war in Southeast Asia and most regrettably, the prospect of increased tension, and protest, and even violence, I'm afraid, here at home.
The British Empire was not a police state. The army was not everywhere, in continual alert. The vast population, on the whole, lived quiet and orderly lives. What threat there was in the wild fringes and border regions. When needed, the British Army was a ruthless force, capable of crushing its enemies with a fierce brutality and efficiency.
Campuses across the nation, students of Kent demonstrated against Nixon's decision to send American troops into Cambodia. National Guardsmen opened fire without warning on a crowd of students, killing 4 who were not even taking part in the demonstration.
Deepened domestic divisions. But it was the right decision and had to be taken. The plan was that we would undertake one attack, that then somebody would announce it, complain, to our amazement, nobody complained. Not Sihanouk, the ruler of the country, not the North Vietnamese, nobody.
Under the U.S. Constitution, bombing Cambodia was an act of war that would require the approval of the U.S. Congress.
Inserted it to say that a country can occupy a part of another country, kill your people, and that then you are violating its neutrality when you respond against the foreign troops that are on that neutral territory.
While I was in South Vietnam, the falsification of strike reports was a common practice. I prepared at least a dozen myself. I got the impression that the practice had been going on for several years prior to the time I got there. All the reports I personally faked were B-52 strikes into Cambodia.
Kissinger approved a plan to conceal the Cambodian bombing missions from military records. Under this dual reporting system, B-52 pilots would be pre-assigned targets in South Vietnam. In mid-flight, their planes would be rerouted by ground radar stations and guided to secret targets in Cambodia. The returning pilots would report that their bombs had been dropped on South Vietnam. Cambodia would never appear in the record.
Against targets that had no air defense system and no anti-aircraft artillery, the RAF's tactics were those of simple terrorism. The British would bomb simple villages as punishment and intimidation. These were easy days for the RAF.
Kissinger's supervision, the U.S. flew 3,600 secret missions over Cambodia in 14 months, dropping 110,000 tons of bombs. Colonel Sitton recalled that Henry Kissinger was intimately involved in the direction and timing of the bombing raid.
I'm going to turn right so goddamn hard it will make your head spin. We'll bomb those bastards right out of off there. I really mean it. Well, and I think you agree, don't you?
I think, Mr. President, we have to make fundamental decisions.
That's right.
Terrible war has been charted behind closed doors. I want those doors open, and I want that war closed.
A week after the first bombs had fallen in Cambodia, rumors of the operation began to surface in the press. Kissinger contacted the FBI to request that wiretaps be used to find the source of the leaks.
He wiretapped American journalists with whom he had supposedly friendly and close relations.
It legitimized me. There I was, a reporter, writer, commentator for the New York Times, and everybody felt a little creepy about, here's this Nixon apologist writing for the Times. But then when it turned out that I was wiretapped, all of a sudden I was in a new fraternity.
He wiretapped aides and associates in the Pentagon.
I was one of the people who was wiretapped while serving under him. I cannot forgive him for being a party to it or for never apologizing.
It was not one of the things that filled me with wild joy. On the other hand, it also seemed a way by which it could be demonstrated that my staff was loyal, but I'm sure there were a complex of reasons that went in.
Under the U.S. Constitution, bombing Cambodia was an act of war that would require the approval of the U.S. Congress.
Have them fly at 95,000 or 110,000 feet and drop the goddamn bombs in the boondocks, but I want a hell of a lot of sorties flown by B-52s today. Is that clear?
Right, Mr. President. The purpose of the strategy was to inflict so much pain on the North Vietnamese that they would enter negotiation.
And we'll blast the hell out of North Vietnam. Exactly. Do you agree?
Absolutely.
And there isn't going to be any bombing hold under any circumstances of anything before the election. We're going to bomb more, believe me.
I had come to the conclusion that the war could not be won militarily, and therefore I favored negotiation. My principal opposite number was leader go.
Good evening. I have asked for this radio and television time tonight for the purpose of announcing that we today have concluded an agreement to end the war and bring peace with honor in Vietnam. And it's...
You know, that speech was a real gem, wasn't it? Oh, that was a beauty. 3 weeks after the bombing ended, Mr. President.
Right.
And you've wrapped it all up.